In the 2002 Danny Boyle horror film 28 Days Later, a group of animal rights activists inadvertently trigger a deadly pandemic after freeing a chimpanzee from a Cambridge laboratory, ignoring warnings that it is infected with rage, a highly contagious virus that induces irrepressible aggression in those it infects. 1 month later, London bicycle courier Jim awakens from a coma to find the city deserted, unaware that the virus has brought about complete societal collapse. Wandering the empty streets, Jim makes his way to a church, where he is suddenly attacked by the infected before being rescued by 2 other survivors, Mark and Selina, who lead him to their hideout in a small shop in the London Underground, where they reveal the full apocalyptic extent of the pandemic. The next morning, the trio make their way to Jim's family home, where Jim learns that his parents died by suicide. During the night, as he reminisces over family memories, the infected attack. When Mark is cut during the encounter, Selina hacks him to death before the virus can take hold. Navigating the city, Jim and Selina spot a makeshift signal in a tower block and go to investigate. Inside, they are defended from the pursuing infected by Frank, a taxi driver, who ushers them into his apartment where he is holed up with his young daughter, Hannah. With supplies rapidly dwindling, Frank shows them a military broadcast offering protection at a blockade in Manchester. Skeptical, but with no other options, the group decide to take the risk. After a dangerous journey in Frank's taxi, they reach the blockade a few days later, only to find it abandoned. While exploring, a drop of blood from a hanging corpse falls into Frank's eye, infecting him. As he turns, soldiers appear on the scene and shoot him dead before taking Jim, Selina, and Hannah to safety in their fortified country mansion, which is commanded by Major Henry West, a capable leader who has established an island of order in the chaos. Once there, however, the group quickly learn of West's true intentions. Believing global civilization to have collapsed, West used the radio signal to lure in female survivors in order to force them into sexual slavery, having promised his demoralized soldiers women as they wait out the infection. Horrified, Jim tries to flee with Selina and Hannah, but is knocked unconscious and imprisoned. When they lead him out to be executed, however, he escapes and begins picking off the soldiers one by one, releasing one of the infected into their midst to wreak havoc. After a hard battle, Jim, Selina, and Hannah reunite, but upon reaching Frank's taxi, they find West hidden inside, and he shoots Jim in the stomach. Hannah, putting the cab into reverse, throws West from the window to be killed by the infected. Another 28 days later, the infected are dying from starvation. Jim awakens in a small rural cottage, having survived thanks to Selina treating his wounds. Rushing outside, the trio unfurl a banner as a jet flies overhead, and wonder if their call for help has been seen. The symbolic subtext of the film is alluded to in its opening scene, where an infected chimpanzee is seen strapped to an operating table as it is forcibly exposed to violent media imagery. The footage visible on the screens includes scenes of mob justice and civil unrest, immediately establishing the rage virus as a metaphor for the forces of collective popular retribution and anger. Moreover, the use of television imagery to treat the infected subject hints at the role of media, and by extension 28 Days Later itself, in suppressing this anger through psychic conditioning and pacification. Moments later, in a coded racial allusion, the hostage research scientist reveals that, quote, the infection is in their blood. It will soon become apparent that the infected blood signifies white racial heredity, the transmission of infection denotes white reproduction, and that the symptoms of the rage virus allude to the sociological concept of white rage. White rage, also known as white backlash, is a term used to describe the fear and anger-motivated responses of white people towards their racial disempowerment and replacement by non-whites. It is this racial reaction that is metaphorically unleashed in the film's opening sequence, with the infected chimpanzee representing the suppressed forces of white anger and hatred, and the laboratory serving as a metaphor for the state and media apparatus that imprisons, controls, and pacifies the Western world's white majority in order to contain their self-preservationary instincts, that is to say, their rage. Throughout the story, this racial subtext is continually implied. Early on, Jim wanders into a London church crammed with the bodies of white dead before they rise to attack, only surviving the encounter thanks to the intervention of Mark and Selina, a black woman. In the following scenes, Selina explains that the outbreak started as rioting in England's small towns and villages, dialogue suggesting its origins in the country's homogeneous white heartlands, and that it was the blood. There was something in the blood. Continuing, she describes an exodus from the cities, in an allusion to the biblical Book of Exodus, establishing a thematic link between the rage virus and the plague said to have been visited upon the Egyptians as punishment for their enslavement of the Hebrews, hinting at themes of racial retribution which will become increasingly explicit. This reiterates the implications of another earlier biblical reference, where Jim finds a postcard on a missing persons board marked with the words, "I will make your grave, for you are vile," Nahum 1:14, a quotation from the Book of Nahum, in which the Jewish deity promised to destroy the people of Nineveh for their sins, vowing in the full passage that, "You will have no descendants to bear your name." Accordingly, we learn that Jim's parents live in Deptford, a pun on the word debt that can, given the film's context, only be intended to evoke the concept of racial debt. In line with these themes, the film is replete with images of brutal violence visited upon whites, both infected and non-infected alike. When Mark is presumed to have come into contact with the virus, Selina hacks him to death with a machete, imagery evoking scenes of migrant crime against England's indigenous white population, but with the non-white assailant framed as driven by justified necessity. Later, when Jim and Selina, who will soon become a mixed-race couple, seek refuge in a tower block, Frank, dressed in full police riot gear and wielding a baton, defends them, beating their white assailants in images bringing to mind Britain's history of nationalist unrest, with Frank's police attire designating him as representing state law enforcement. In another sequence, Jim beats an infected white child to death with a baseball bat after the boy screams the words, "I hate you," showing that the rage virus denotes not just anger but hatred, and that even white children cannot be spared. It is repeatedly suggested, however, that there is a cure to be found to the corruption signified by the rage virus through racial mixing, and scenes implying this mixing serve as the only respite from the film's visions of apocalyptic death and despair. In one sequence, Jim and his companions take refuge in the remnants of an old abbey, imagery literally placing them amidst the ruins of England. While resting, they observe a family of black and white horses running free. The older horses are white, and the younger horses, denoting the next generation, are black. Watching the idyllic scene, Hannah asks if they are infected, to which Frank responds, "No, they're just fine," taking a bite out of an apple in a clear allusion to the biblical myth of the Garden of Eden. Racial mixing, we are told, is the forbidden fruit that will cure the white race of its sickness. Fittingly, Jim and Selina shortly after initiate their interracial relationship, the Garden of Eden symbolism prefiguring their narrative role as a new Adam and Eve, and therefore as the progenitors of a new racially hybridized England. Notably, this scene immediately follows Jim's aforementioned killing of the white child, retroactively revealing it as the symbolic extermination of England's potential future white progeny in exchange for a mixed-race future, and confirming that the only cure for rage is to extinguish the undiluted white bloodline, either through mixing or through violence. To emphasize this message, throughout the film whites are continually subliminally associated with hopelessness, death, and extinction, while non-whites are identified with hope, life, and survival. The white Jim is at first helpless without the black Selina, repeatedly calling upon her to save him in scenes designed to ingrain the notion that whites need non-whites in order to survive. Thus, in the film's final act, Jim only lives thanks to the medical intervention of Selina. Earlier, when they take refuge in Frank's flat, Selina says of Frank and his daughter, "They're desperate. They probably need us more than we need them," a statement serving as coded racial and social commentary, suggesting England's existential need for non-white immigrants and racial mixing. This is reiterated in a later scene at the soldier's mansion, wherein Major West complains that eggs served for dinner, eggs having obvious reproductive connotations, are rancid, before a black soldier interjects, remarking, "Don't worry, we'll have eggs again, once everything's back to normal." Major Henry West himself, as his name bluntly indicates, is a personification of Western patriarchal power and authority. His base is in an archetypal English country house, symbolically anchoring him to the world of English tradition, wealth, and aristocracy, and it is surrounded by fortified, heavily guarded borders like those of a nation. His company even includes some non-whites under his command, alluding to global Western hegemony over the non-white world. This subtext will be confirmed when West reveals that he is keeping an infected black soldier held captive in the compound, the chains around his neck serving as an obvious reference to African chattel slavery. Correspondingly, West attempts to sexually enslave Selena in an effort on the part of the film's writers to evoke the white man's supposed rape of the non-white world through colonialism. We learn, however, that there is a means to combat the tyranny of West and the Western world he personifies through turning the violence, hatred, and anger denoted by the rage virus upon it. In the film's climactic scenes, Jim infiltrates West's mansion and releases the infected black soldier into the company's midst, freeing him from his chains to wreak havoc in a microcosmic allegory for the present-day emancipation and weaponization of the racial other against Western societies and white patriarchal power. More, Jim harnesses his own rage, to the point of almost seeming to become one of the infected, but turns it righteously against West and his soldiers, embodying the real-world forces of white self-destruction as he brutally exterminates them to liberate the captive racial other. These allusions to immigration, demographic change, and racial conflict are reinforced by repeated cuts to the classical statue of Laocoon and his sons, which depicts a famous scene from Greek mythology. In the Roman poet Virgil's account, Laocoon, known by posterity for the words, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," was a Trojan priest who, along with his sons, tried to warn his people of the danger of the Trojan horse, piercing it with a spear when they refused to listen to him. For this, he was punished by the gods, who sent great sea serpents to slay him and his offspring. In the context of 28 Days Later and its central racial allegory, the conspicuous presence of this statue can only be intended to assert that whites who resist the Trojan horse of non-white immigration will be destroyed. Fittingly, in the film's climax, West is slain by the infected black soldier he had kept chained, the slave devouring his former master in a moment of karmic racial retribution with clear real-world connotations. This, then, is the real meaning of 28 Days Later. The white race is a destructive force proliferating itself through consumption, violence, and reproduction. This force has been in the modern world contained through a state and media program of psychological confinement and conditioning designed to pacify and ultimately rehabilitate it, which, though appearing inhumane, is in fact justified and necessary. At any time, however, human actions could cause it to be unleashed upon the world, with existential consequences for mankind. The only cure for this racial sickness and the threat it poses to human posterity is the eradication of its carriers, through violence or through racial mixing. Only those whites who have accepted hybridization with the racial other will survive, and their non-white offspring will inherit a new England and a new Western world, purified of its tainted ancestral inheritance. 28 Days Later is establishment propaganda designed to legitimize the anti-white ideology and multicultural program of the modern British state, to provide moral sanction for white racial erasure, and to psychologically neuter white resistance to both. Its subliminal implication is that whites are terminally sick and will not survive without racial mixing. Over the past century, the Western world has been subjected to rapid, organized demographic change imposed from the top down. As part of this process, racial outsiders have been resettled in vast numbers into formerly homogeneous white countries, then artificially elevated through the systematic transference of white wealth, property, and power into their possession. This has now made non-natives culturally, socially, and politically ascendant throughout the Western world. The natives, conversely, face decline, disempowerment, and ultimately, if trends continue, extinction. This engineered transformation would never have been possible, however, if the indigenous population had not first been targeted with cultural programming designed to deactivate their racial survival instincts, and it can be said without exaggeration that this is the primary purpose of modern Western entertainment media. 28 Days Later is emblematic of this mass psychic conditioning program, and its creative function, simply put, is to serve as a vector for memes specifically designed to diffuse the self-preservationary impulses of its white audience. When threatened, it is the natural and necessary response of any people to mobilize in their own defense, and this manifests in its most elemental form in collective anger and aggression. Thus far, however, the culture controllers have mostly been able to suppress this organic tribal reaction through conditioning whites into an unnatural state of psychological passivity and deracinated, atomized individualism that prevents them from taking any meaningful action to ensure their survival. One of the most effective methods employed to this end has been the invention and perpetuation of the notion of racism, a conceptual contrivance designed to pathologize Western man's natural racial instincts and prejudices through framing them as immoral and irrational, and thereby contradictory to his self-image as a moral and rational creature. It is well understood by those who hold the reins of cultural power that once this notion has been accepted and internalized on a collective level, the long-term racial survival of the targeted group becomes impossible. The only obstacle to the fulfillment of these ends lay in finding a means of entrenching an idea so contrary to nature and to human instinct. This could only be made possible through presenting it in dramatically compelling, symbolic terms, which could effectively mask its true function and intent. In other words, it was necessary to move beyond the realm of the academic and theoretical and into the medium of fiction in order to harness the emotional power of myth. In the 20th century, the zombie myth would provide fertile ground for this purpose. According to the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, the only modern myth is the myth of zombies, and the zombie myth in its modern incarnation has been most commonly interpreted as a representation of capitalist consumption. This now widespread viewpoint, though partly correct, wittingly or unwittingly ignores the racial connotations of the genre's narrative tropes. After all, zombies consume in order to reproduce, and their mode of reproduction is the transmission of blood and other bodily fluids. Zombies act moreover as a collective who direct their violence towards the outgroup to grow and empower the in-group. These racial implications would be explored in George Romero's 1968 film Night of the Living Dead, which brought the zombie myth into the Western world's popular consciousness and distilled it as a coded critique of white consumption and reproduction. It can be readily observed that Hollywood media has consistently portrayed non-whites, and blacks in particular, as possessing a life and vitality lacking in whites. This is usually done through presenting them as vibrant, social, spontaneous, and spiritual, and contrasting these human qualities against white rigidity and coldness. In other words, through juxtaposing the aspects of life against those of death. With Night of the Living Dead, this implicit suggestion would be literalized in the struggle between an eminently human black hero figure and the inhuman horde of white undead, a narrative dynamic allegorically pitting the racial other as protagonist against white racial collectivism as antagonist. To accentuate the subliminal effects of this underlying metaphor, the zombies were even presented wearing powdered whiteface. With the film's cinematic release having come at the height of the civil rights movement, the real-world political and racial messaging is in hindsight explicit. The popularity of Night of the Living Dead would help establish many of the genre's enduring tropes. The prevalence of a non-white protagonist as a messianic hero representing life, hope, and humanity. Whites as living death, disease, and inhumanity. Whiteness as a destructive force perpetuating itself through infection reproduction, fed by relentless violent consumption. Anti-white violence and implied racial mixing as the cure for the sickness. The film's sequels Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead would reiterate these basic themes. Later, they would be joined by such films as I Am Legend, in which a black savior figure does battle with blue-eyed, white-skinned mutants in an apocalyptic Manhattan, and series like The Walking Dead, which was replete with racial storylines and imagery, including a black heroine who fights with two maimed and enslaved white undead for protection, and the suicide of the lead character's white son, followed by his narrative substitution with his mixed-race half-brother at the end of the story. In a new twist, 28 Days Later targets not just white consumption and reproduction, but white anger, presenting it in the allegorical form of the rage virus. It does this in order to frame our anger as a disease that strips those it infects of their logical faculties, their rational self-control, and their grip upon their own humanity, all in order to tap into civilized Western man's deepest and most enduring fear, the fear of becoming a monster. Thus, these inhibited primal forces are archetypally represented by a caged beast, signifying the repressed animal soul, whose liberation, we are warned, would bring death and disaster to mankind. Having been shown this catastrophic possible future, we are then offered a means of averting it through our racial self-overthrow. 28 Days Later has a purpose beyond behavioral reconditioning, however, for it also clearly prefigures events that would come to transpire long after its authorship, making it a form of predictive programming. Like all such programming, this was intended both to help engineer future conditions and outcomes, and to preemptively frame emerging events in the collective consciousness, so as to dictate the manner in which they would be perceived as they came to unfold. Thus, the rise of white self-preservationary anger, as manifest for example in the 2024 England riots, has been understood in the popular mind, through subconscious association with ingrained fictional tropes and narratives, as a manifestation of a dangerous and irrational sickness. Films like 28 Days Later have had their intended narrative-forming effects. And as the violence and hatred of the racial interloper, as well as the repressive actions of the hostile institutions with which they are aligned, intensify, so too will the media messaging designed to redirect and neutralize white backlash against it, and to provide moral sanction for more radical measures taken against our kind. It is certain that the upcoming sequel 28 Years Later has been specifically contrived for precisely these ends, and that its antagonists will be the white cults and tribes that denote white efforts to collectivize and survive in the face of existential danger. If they are to live, a people must have the will to fight and the will to hate. This is the incontrovertible truth of life in this world, made hideous in our eyes because it is viewed through the clouded lens of a false morality that condemns as evil the demands that survival makes of us, and the very instincts that empower us to meet them. For as long as we despise those instincts, whether they reveal themselves in hatred, or in prejudice, or in anger, we despise an inalienable part of our own being, and this reviled inner nature will appear in our eyes as a monster to wreak a vengeance upon us. But if we embrace it without judgment or reproof, the veil will be lifted, and it will show itself as a friend once more. The beast within was only ever a monster to those who had cause to fear it.